Okay, so we're picking up with Jackson as president. And this slide and the next one just have to do with what Jackson's presidency looked like. And the first thing to keep in mind is that Jackson saw himself as the direct representative of the people and the embodiment of national power. He thought that it was his job to be the spokesperson of the people and to always keep the people's interests and desires at heart whenever he was making decisions. Another thing that Jackson is known for is lots of vetoes. All of the previous presidents had 9 vetoes combined, and Jackson had 12 by himself. And most of those had to do with internal improvements, the recharter of the National Bank, the tariffs. But either way, Jackson used the veto as a political weapon many times against his political rival, Henry Clay. While Jackson wasn't a huge states' rights advocate like, say, John C. Calhoun, he really had no desire to expand federal authority at the expense of the states. Jackson tried to keep a moderate course on sectional issues, and the issue of this time really is just cheap land and low tariffs. Westerners wanted cheap land as they were expanding the frontiers, and Southerners wanted low tariffs because the high tariffs that were meant to protect Northern industry subsequently harmed the South when they were trying to buy goods that were not produced in their own region. So John C. Calhoun, one of the post-revolutionary heroes from South Carolina, proposed that the South and the West form an alliance that would be based on cheap land and low tariffs. And they used a strong states' rights stance in order to argue this. And Jackson really got caught in the middle of this one because he had proposed that any surplus federal revenues be given back to the states. But if the federal government gave back the surplus revenues to the states, then it could not reduce the price of public lands without going into debt. So Jackson really tried to maintain a moderate position on these issues because on one hand you have John C. Calhoun pulling hard for the South and the West, and then for the North you have Daniel Webster, who successfully blocked this South/West alliance by arguing that the Constitution was a compact of the American people, not just of the states. And so he argued so effectively that he made the states' rights position almost seem treasonous because the states were receiving gains over the federal government. And he argued so well that he was nominated for president. Another important issue in Jackson's presidency was the bank veto. And he distrusted the banks just as much as Thomas Jefferson had because he believed that it held too much power and power without accountability. And he also believed that it was unconstitutional since the Constitution didn't directly grant the federal government the right to create a national bank. So he felt that it was a threat to the American economy, to the American people. So between 1832 and 1833, he used the veto to dismantle the Second Bank of the U.S. By vetoing its recharter. And then in 1833, he took further action against the bank when he removed federal funds from the Second Bank of the U.S. and relocated the money into local state banks throughout the nation. Jackson had long pursued a policy of Indian removal, and this was simply because he believed that they were savages and that they were incapable of self-government. So he really wanted to remove them completely from the path of white settlement, and he thought that this was the humane thing to do if their tribes were to keep growing. So in his mind, the government would give them a fair price for their land, and pay to resettle them, and then both would be the better for it. There were a couple of rulings by John Marshall which gave legitimacy to the natives in Georgia. And the first one was a decision in Worcester versus Georgia, where he ruled that the state could not control the Cherokee or their territory because they weren't a part of Georgia. And then in another case, he overturned the conviction for murder of a Cherokee named Corntassel on the ground that the crime had taken place in Cherokee territory. Jackson, despite that, backed Georgia, and he signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and this led to the removal of about 15,000 Cherokee from Georgia who were relocated in Oklahoma. And about 4,000 of them died along the way, so a little less than a third. And he did this because he insisted that no independent nation could exist within the United States. And Cornhassel, who was acquitted by Chief Justice Marshall, was then hanged. So the bigger issue was that Jackson allowed Georgia to ignore the decision of the Supreme Court, which urged Southern states' writers to push for the doctrine of nullification. So this brings us to the nullification crisis. Just a little bit of back history here. The Tariff of Abominations, named by the South, was passed in 1828, and the tariff was called that because it harmed the South directly by forcing them to pay higher prices on goods that they did not produce, and it harmed them indirectly because reducing the exportation of British goods to the United States made it difficult for the British to pay for the cotton that they imported from the South. So the Tariff of 1832, fast forward 4 years later, was an act that would try to remedy the conflict created by the previous tariff. So basically what that did, it pushed the duties on citizens from 45% down to 35%. For instance, the duty on hemp, which had been $60 a ton in 1828, was reduced to $40 a ton in 1832 by the new tariff. But Southerners were still unhappy with the tariff. They were so unhappy with the tariff that they turned to Calhoun's doctrine of nullification as their logical defense. And the doctrine of nullification said that if a federal law was harmful to a state, then they should have the right to nullify it. Well, Jackson believed that if a state could nullify a federal law, then the Union could not exist, which is ironic since he had just allowed Georgia to defy a federal ruling by Chief Justice John Marshall. So anyway, South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification that prohibited the collection of tariff duties in the state and voted to authorize the raising of an army. So Jackson responded with military preparations of his own. And in a presidential proclamation, he warned that, quote, disunion by armed force is treason, end quote. So ultimately, Congress compromised by reducing the tariff and by passing a force bill, which allowed the president additional authority to enforce revenue laws if necessary. So since South Carolina was satisfied with the reductions of the new tariff, they repealed the nullification ordinance. And they attempted to save face by nullifying the Force Act, which was dead by this point anyway. The bigger issue here was that this crisis proved that South Carolina could not successfully stand up to the federal government without the support of other slave states, which they began to work for ceaselessly. So during Jackson's presidency, the economy experienced a rapid boom and bust. An increased volume of currency caused the land prices to skyrocket. So this led to a frenzy for people to invest in property. Prices went up like 15% in 6 months, which made investors really optimistic about making money with land investments. Proceeds from the land sales wiped out the government's debt completely and actually produced a government surplus. And alarmed by the speculative mania, Jackson issued a specie circular, and this basically required purchasers of government land to pay in gold and silver. And this brought the economic boom to a rapid end. Demand for land immediately slacked, prices sagged, speculators began to default on mortgages because they didn't have gold and silver to pay in. Banks couldn't recover enough on foreclosed property to recover their loans. People rushed to withdraw their money in the form of gold or silver from the banks. So the banks were exhausted of supply. Panic swept the country. And while there were numerous factors that caused the swings in economic cycle, Jackson's policies made them worse. This slide just gives us a quick look at the kinds of people that supported Jackson. Jackson had supporters who were rich, many who were poor, some from the East, some from the West, people who opposed slavery, slaveholders. Most of them were very suspicious of large business corporations. Most of them favored states' rights. And many of them, like Jackson, supported opportunities for the less affluent. And if you remember, that's one of the ways that Jackson got elected was that he appealed to the common man. And he believed that any ordinary citizen could hold office and do a good job if they received the proper training. So this really just goes to show that Jackson had supporters from all realms of society. The rise of the Whig Party. Jackson's opposition remained less cohesive. Really the only thing that held them together was that they agreed on hating Jackson. And I mean, that was pretty much it. Their strategy for winning the election of 1836 was to pull favorite son candidates. This is just like American heroes from that post-revolutionary generation, like Daniel Webster or William Henry Harrison. But at any rate, this strategy did not produce the victory that they wanted, and they were unable to defeat Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren had served as Secretary of State under Jackson in 1829 to 1831, and also Vice President to Jackson during his second term. So one of the things that Van Buren was known for was approaching problems pragmatically. That is that he tried to actually solve problems in a practical way rather than relying on a theory or some other philosophical way to approach a problem. Like Jackson, he fought the U.S. Bank, but he also opposed irresponsible state banks as well. In regards to internal improvements, he wasn't really for or against them. He just preferred that the state fund internal improvements. One of the things that was really unfortunate for Van Buren and was the reason he wasn't reelected again was the Panic of 1837, which he did not cause, but his policies didn't really do anything to help it. And this happened when banks stopped converting paper money to gold and silver. But that actually eased the pressure on the money market, and interest rates did decrease. But the panic was frightening, but it was short-lived. Just as the country was recovering from the Panic of 1837, cotton prices suddenly and drastically declined in 1839. So state governments defaulted on their debts, which discouraged investors, and that resulted in a general economic depression that lasted until 1843. And so again, Van Buren didn't really cause those things, but he didn't do much to help them. The Depression convinced Van Buren that he needed some place other than state banks to keep federal funds. And so he settled on the idea of removing the government from all banking activities. And so he passed the Independent Treasury Act, and this lasted from 1846 to 1921. And it called for the construction of government-owned vaults to store the federal revenues. And so all payments made to the government would be made in hard cash, that is either specie, gold and silver, or treasury notes. While the plan was probably economically irresponsible, the system worked pretty well for many years. The Log Cabin Campaign. It wasn't just the Depression and the panic that caused Van Buren's failure in the election of 1840. It was also that the Whigs were better organized this time. And they actually took the tactic of the Democrats by nominating a popular general and by shouting the praises of the common man. And there was, again, high voter turnout for this election. William Henry Harrison used the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And Tippecanoe referred to Harrison's military defeat of a group of Shawnee Indians in Ohio at Tippecanoe in 1811. And Tyler, of course, referred to his vice president candidate. And Democrats actually laughed at Harrison and mocked him for being too old because he was 67 at the time. They referred to him as Granny, saying that he was senile and had lost his mental capability. One Democratic newspaper said, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and he'll sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin." So the Whig response to that was the Log Cabin Campaign. And so they took advantage of that. And so they declared that Harrison was the log cabin and the hard cider candidate, a man of the common people from the rough and tumble West. And so they depicted his opponent, Martin Van Buren, who was called Martin Van Ruin after the panic, as a wealthy snob who was not in touch with the people. So, in fact, it was Harrison who came from a wealthy, prominent family, while Van Buren was from a poor, working family. But that doesn't really matter when you're campaigning. So Harrison was elected by a large margin and sadly died of pneumonia a month after being elected. So he was succeeded by his vice president, John Tyler. And John Tyler, with his presidency, events took a different turn, one that would lead to civil war.